The Devine Watchmaker. Written and narrated by Chuck Missler and Dr. Mark Eastman.
Bishop William Paley in 1818 suggested in effect that the watch with its gears and springs and other mechanisms could never arise by actions of random chance alone. And then as time went on, David Hume came along. He's not the only one, but his position was that living systems only have the appearance of machines. Unless it can be proven that living systems are indeed machines at the molecular level, then Paley's watchmaker argument is irrelevant. And Hume is only one spokesman for this. Docking wrote a book by the name of The Blind Watchmaker. There have been all kinds of refutations as secular humanists of various shapes and sizes, many of them posing as scientists, attempted to disparage William Paley's argument. And one thing we all should recognize is the field of science is no different than any other profession. They cling to their prejudices and presumptions just as tenaciously and just as emotionally as all professions do. And someone has once quipped, trying to find an objective scientist is as hard as trying to find a Christian who loves their enemies. So I'll leave that one alone. We're going to go down a path tonight that's a little different. This whole idea of the divine watchmaker, if you will. The fact that one approach, it's an approach that appeals to me in dealing with evolution. It's easy when you start talking about these kinds of things to get mired armpit deep in fossils and geological arguments, half-truths and of all kinds, and many falsehoods of all kinds, and even many deliberate deceptions. And you wallow around in that world. That's one approach. And even if you do that competently, of course, it refutes evolution for lots of reasons. But there's another approach that I think is more practical, easier for me at least as a systems engineer to relate to, and that's the path we're going down. Now it's interesting that modern science today, that you and I have the advantage of, has revealed that even the simplest mechanisms are complex machines beyond our imagining. This dichotomy that was proposed between living organisms and machines has been refuted. Science, in effect, has refuted Hume and totally vindicated Paley. Fred Hoyle, in his writings in 1981, pointed out that the speculation of the origin of the species, the famous work by Darwin, has turned out to be wrong. It is ironic that scientific facts throw Darwin out on the one hand, but leave Paley, in effect, the ultimate winner. So Michael Denton, now there's an author you want to get familiar with. He's an evolutionist. And yet his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, is a fabulous reading if you have any technical background, because even though he's an evolutionist, he points out eloquently and competently and thoroughly that in almost all fields of science today, evolution no longer is a satisfactory rationale for what we think we know. And one of the things he points out, that although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, see the whole concept of Darwin is, he spoke of a simple cell. Well, today we know there is no such thing. Even these small cells, is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. So the fact that our living organisms are machines, very exquisitely designed machines, in effect validates Paley's argument and puts us on sound ground as we look at the premise of evolution as being totally contrary to fact and reason. But let's move on a little bit. We talk about the watch. You know, my ability to convince you that my watch came around by accident is, of course, absurd. And yet, a normal watch on your wrist is what's called a simple open-loop system. And the wrist that it resides on is far more complex than the watch, because it's a complex closed-loop servo system. I'll come back to that. It even adapts itself to the ambient conditions. If it's invaded, it has armies that fight off the invaders, called white corpuscles. And also, to a large extent, it's self-repairing. Now, as a design engineer, one quickly recognizes that the wrist that the watch is residing on is a vastly more complex design challenge than the watch itself, which is a simple open-loop system. What do I mean by an open-loop system? It's simply a single thread design. There's typically some form of energy source. There's some kind of a mechanism that does a certain job. Generally, the mechanism has no knowledge of its own failure should it fail. In other words, it's just a simple, what's called an open loop system. And the example of that, of course, is the watch. There are many examples we could point to. The next level of design complexity, which is vastly more complex, is what's called a closed loop system. And we may have some ambient environment. We have some sensor that senses that environment, some mechanism to respond to that, which presumably alters the ambient environment. And all of this is relative to some datum. For example, your thermostat in your home is in effect a closed loop system. Your datum you set, the temperature you want. There's a sensor that senses the difference between the ambient and what you want, tells the mechanism what to do, and it adjusts the ambient. And when the sensor nulls to zero, it's complete. An air conditioning system is perhaps even a better example. So that's a closed loop system. Another example of this would be the power steering on your car, where it senses a disparity from where it is and where you want it to be, adjusts accordingly. There's probably one mechanical engineer in 100 that knows how to balance out a Nyquist diagram, that knows how to properly diagnose an inadequate design of a closed loop system. It's vastly more complex than an open loop system, as any engineer can tell you. But it gets worse than that. The next level is what you could call adaptive systems. But there's also adaptive control, which will examine the processes going on and adjust the system behavior accordingly. Probably one example you're familiar with is your automatic braking system, where not only does it automatically brake, but it has a way of sensing the coefficient of friction and the other aspects to adjust its behavior. Perhaps a better example is a numerically controlled machinery, which not only will machine a part, but the advanced ones will be sensitive to changes in density of the material and adjust itself accordingly. These things start to get extremely complicated. Why? Because we suddenly have all kinds of subsystems that are interacting. And one of the things you quickly realize, if you think about it, if you have a complex system consisting of many subsystems, if the subsystems deteriorate, the total system doesn't survive. That's a basic problem. If you try to assume a rationale that these systems occur by random accident. It's absolutely absurd, of course. Anyone that's been a member of a complex design team, if he thinks about it, he's very familiar with the entropy laws as they operate in human nature, as well as things. So one of the evolutionary fallacies is that self-organization, as people like to talk about, violates the entropy laws. This whole idea that matter plus energy can somehow, with random chance, result in organization. Not so. It always results in disorganization. That's the entropy laws. At local levels, for a short period of time, we sometimes think we observe violations of that, but the entropy laws are very much at work. We observe them in all fields of science, and the Scripture also describes it. In fact, describes it in terms of a response, God's response to Genesis chapter 3. Romans 8 speaks of the bondage of decay, and so forth. So that's one of the basic fallacies of evolution. For example, you've all seen a camera. Especially, let's take one of these self-focusing cameras. Can you imagine a camera like that occurring by accident? Hardly. Well, how does that camera compare to your human eye? It's vastly inferior. And Mark, in his presentation, will talk a little more about that. But the other thing that's overlooked, especially by most biologists and others that I've heard try to justify evolution, is they have very little background in system design. And if you have complex system assemblies, they require all subsystems to be functional for system survival. One of the best examples is the sonar system of a dolphin. In its unusual skull, it has a very sophisticated sonar system. The mathematics of that are incredible, because it's got to measure, in effect, sound transmitting through different media. And it's marvelous. That's the way it finds its food. Well, the problem is, suppose that sonar system isn't quite functional. Suppose we're talking about evolution and it's only half functional. What happens to the dolphin? It starves. See, the subsystems have to be functional for the system to survive. Let me give you an example. This is a VW engine. I won't bother to enumerate the various subsystems that have to interact properly for this thing to run. And as you know, whether it's a distributor or whatever, it doesn't take much of a failure for this thing to die. The idea of this, you can even talk about the pistons and their fit in the cylinders and make foolishness of evolution. But when on top of that you start talking about the interactive subsystems, it becomes even more foolish. But let's take a modern jet fighter with its electronic fire controls. The missile alone is more complex than most people have any capacity to imagine, and the total weapon system is staggering. Now, if you believe in evolution, that's like saying that a tornado going through a junkyard could leave behind a fully functional jet fighter. Not very likely, and yet that's really the premise of evolution as it is commonly perceived. What we're really dealing with here is the hierarchy of design. The simplest level of design to a design engineer is the open loop system. And we could give you all kinds of examples, but I think that's pretty straightforward. Next level of complexity, of course, as we've mentioned, is the closed loop system, where you have the system has an error response that it's following. And as you make that more sophisticated, going to the second derivative, as the mathematician would put it, you have adaptive systems that will adapt to their environment, adapt to ambience, adapt to slightly modified missions, etc. Now this leads then to a class of machine that starts to get rather intriguing, and that's called a self-modifying machine, where the machine itself, under certain circumstances, will alter its own design. Let me tell you, that gets complicated. That challenges the best minds we have. The simplest form of a modifiable machine, of course, probably in the 1800s, was these complex weaving machines that would weave patterns. They would follow a program that would direct the machine to weave some particular pattern in the fabric. And that was a very popular, a very revolutionary thing during the Industrial Revolution, a shared program. It doesn't take much of a step to go from that to where the program is stored in a media in which the machine itself can modify the program. And this kind of idea lies at the core of what's called a von Neumann machine. John von Neumann, mathematician, it was one of the early pioneers in the architecture of computers. He recognized very early the implications of a machine not just processing data, but changing its program. The difference between a calculator and a calculator can be very sophisticated. It can do some very complex equations. But if the machine can alter the program that it's running, that's more than a calculator. That's technically what you'd call a von Neumann machine. That's what you really call a computer. The miracle of the computer world is that we've developed information appliances that can not only reach in storage and deal with data, it can reach into storage and deal with programs and change the programs as the conditions meet. And then, of course, to finish this out, you need some way for this collection of hardware to communicate with what's called the external world. Input-output circuitry. It can be a keyboard on a computer and a display coming back. It can be any of a number of other things. But the point is, the idea of input-output equipment, getting information into storage and then having the processor follow a program and then modify that program when it needs to. Now, what most people don't realize is that the computer, once you've done this, you've developed what's called an infinite state machine. In other words, this machine, you can never exhaust by analysis all the conceivable states it might take, because it quickly can become very randomized. But moving on. So we've gone from open loop, closed loop, adaptive systems, self-modifying systems. Now we've suddenly plunged our way into a class that are called intelligent machines. Now, the first class of intelligent machines I've just covered, that's a self-modifying machine. That's the first primitive level. And that's what most of us have had experience with. But one of the things that comes along then are machines that are self-programming. It's possible to take a computer and give it software and other capabilities that allow it to program itself. Very commonly done, more commonly than most people realize. That's obviously another level of sophistication. But if you want to go up the ladder, so to speak, the next level of complexity is a self-diagnostic computer. Now, we do that in very primitive ways, but we do have some self-diagnostic capability in computers. But anyone that has been assigned a project in that world knows that is tough stuff, getting into that kind of a world. The kind of self-diagnosis capability that's available in most equipment is actually very primitive as to what we'd like. In some of the advanced fire control stuff that in the Defense Department, it's a level higher, and yet it's still, by any rational standard, still primitive. But the next level after being self-diagnostic is self-repairing. I've been in the computer industry for more than 3 decades. I've served on the board of the Computer Industry Association in Washington for 15 years. And having said all that, I know of no meaningful example of self-repairing computers. I just want you to understand that that's a level that is something that's at the moment a dream of the theoreticians. But if we were going to stretch our imagination even further, what's the next level higher? Not only one that's self-diagnostic and self-repairing, but self-reproducing. A little scary, isn't it? That's really in the realm of science fiction for most of us. And yet, as you look at this level, I want you to recognize that each one of these levels represents an order of magnitude greater complexity. It's a complexity that the best minds and resources on the planet Earth have yet to master. And yet every one of us sitting in this room are examples of the result of that kind of design. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go further. One of the fallacies that everyone indulges in, especially at the high school biological level and in most of the stuff that you read about in the evolution, they speak of the simple cell. And that is a fraud, because we now know today that the simplest bacterial cell is not simple at all. It's complex beyond our imagining. As we understand it, it is unparalleled in its complexity, and its design is self-adaptive. If we peek inside, we find it has a central memory bank coordinating the flow of all kinds of materials and information throughout its very complex organization. As we look inside the cell, we find assembly plants that are processing, and all kinds of processing units that are creating and fabricating materials. We find that it's filled with robot machines. The proton molecules, in effect, form that function. We find there are automated factories in the simplest cell. We find that their operations involve artificial languages, decoding systems. There are memory banks that not only store information, but in fact make copies of it as it's necessary for its performance. We find incredibly elegant control systems regulating the automated assembly of components. We find there's prefabrication and then modular construction. We find that there's error, fail-safe, and proofreading devices for quality control. If you can imagine a cell blown up to the size of, say, a 10-mile big model, you go through here and you find millions of machines that are not only functional, but they also change their function as the need requires. Now, if we start comparing the design technology inside the simplest cell, well, first of all, we find it's unequaled any place on the Earth, the complexity of those factories that are working. Furthermore, this complex collection of assembly plants can replicate its entire structure in a matter of a few hours. Let's make a model of this. Let's imagine that we're going to take a cell and we're going to build a model of this cell that's 1,000 million times larger than the actual cell. We'll discover, to do so, that would make an atom about the size of a tennis ball. We first of all discover that we need about 10 million atoms, that this model then would be about 10 miles in diameter. And if we start building this model 1 atom a minute, it would take us 50 million years to make one of these. It's that complicated. 1 atom a minute takes you 50 million years. So the complexity that's involved here staggers the imagination. Let's shift a little bit and talk about something else. We could talk about all kinds of organisms. So let's talk about the human brain. The human brain has about 10 to the 10th nerve cells. Each of these nerve cells has somewhere between 10 to the 4th and 10 to the 5th, that's 10,000 to 100,000, connecting fibers to each of them. That approaches about 10 to the 15th connections. That's in your brain and mine. You say, well, what's so impressive about that? That's pretty abstract. Because most of us have a tough time. What do you mean about 10 to the 15th connections? Well, let's make a model. Let's find a forest that's half the size of the United States. That's 1 million square miles. This is a forest that has 10,000 trees per square mile and has an average of 100,000 leaves per tree. And you've got 10 to the 15th equivalent. That's how many connections are in your brain, as to the best of the neural estimates. Our human brain represents a highly organized network of uniquely adaptive communication channels. If only 1 in 100 of these connections were specifically organized pathways, it would represent more connections than the entire communication systems on the planet Earth. That's in your brain. By the way, this all happened by accident, random chance, just happens. You gotta be kidding. Now there's another aspect I'd like to talk about that most people might miss. Because most of us in here, I think, have had some exposure to computers. I can talk a little bit about language. And the role of language is a whole other can of peas. Language consists of 2 basic elements. The first is what's called semantics. That's the meaning. And perhaps the simplest form of message that most of us are familiar with is the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. We all heard the famous poem where Paul Revere watched the Old North Church to see if there'd be the lanterns, one if by land, 2 if by sea, right? When he saw that, he ran and rode and passed the message, and we all of us as students of American history are familiar with the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. That example happens to be binary information, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. It's a binary code. Well, the first question is, what's magical about 1 or 2 lanterns? Who cares? I mean, how does it come to mean 1 if by land, 2 if by sea? And the answer, of course, is by pre-agreement. The guy that was sent on the mission to put the lantern on was privy to a code. Paul Revere knew the code. Some stranger, if you and I were on one of the shores and saw it, would mean nothing to us unless we were familiar with the meaning that had been arbitrarily assigned to that. I'm always reminded when I talk about codes, a friend of mine was assigned as a British officer in Turkey. And he was in his barracks one night, his bachelor officer quarters, and 3 jeeps arrived in the middle of the night outside. And the Turkish hosts, they grabbed him, put him in the middle jeep and ran him off over to headquarters. And he couldn't figure out what's got them so upset, because their English was terrible. Even the translator, he starts getting interrogated rather roughly, and he can't figure out what's bothering these guys. The translator wasn't that good, and there's all this hassle to figure out what's got these guys so upset. Well, you need to understand that his mother was in a habit of sending him what we sometimes call care packages from home. You know, Hershey bars and his favorite things is just a way of reminding him he's thought of at home. And so she always would send him, what we do every couple of weeks or so, a care package of goodies. Well, apparently, this particular time, she sent him some fortune cookies in the care package. And the Turkish officers that were checking all the mail had never seen a fortune cookie before, and they were convinced these were secret messages. And it took him most of the night to convince them that this was just a traditional form of Chinese cooking and so forth. It finally all quieted down. He did point out to me that he never got as excited as the other guys did about mail call after that. But language emerges because of an agreement in meaning. And we typically call that semantics, but it also has another thing called syntax, that is, positional rules. If this character was sending the signal to Paul Revere, he had to hang the lantern in the Old North Church. Position is significant. Our arithmetic has positional notation. As you know, if you write a check, it's very important how many zeros you put after the number, right? You see? The number 2 can mean one thing if the decimal point's behind it. It means quite another if there's quite a few zeros after it. Yes, you understand. So there's a concept called positional notation. Language has much more, but the 2 basic parts of its structure are semantics, which are arbitrary assigned meaning to symbols. Are we together? And syntax, which is the rules of order. Different languages have different syntax. Those of you that know German know that the Germans love to leave all the verbs at the end of the sentence and so forth. And so we have these strange rules that to us sound strange until we're used to it. That's why sometimes these things get fractured. That's why they say, you know, throw the cow over the fence some hay, you know, that whole sort of thing. So, but moving on. Now the question, when you look at language, you have to think, does language arise by coordinated planning or design or random accident? Hardly. There's all kinds of humorous examples we could take where words in one language mean quite something different in another. And when you visit different cultures, it's very important to understand that even though you may both speak English in its classical sense, you want to understand the idioms of the place. And if you go to England and stay at a board and breakfast, don't get upset when she asks you what time you want to be knocked up in the morning. You just got to get used to those figures of speech. I want to specifically focus on digital codes. They're symbolic codes. Digital codes derive their meaning from arbitrary but consistent definitions called semantics. That's true in computers with ones and zeros that clustered to be other representations. They're arbitrary but consistent. They're also dependent upon their context or syntax. Digital codes, by their nature, speak of design. The opposite of design is random accident or chance. Now, there are all kinds of coding structures. One of the simplest coding structures is what might be called a simplex alphabet. One example is Morse code. Dot dash is A. Dash dot is N. Why? Well, because they took a list of letters that are normally used in English. They decided the most frequent one is E, so they made E just a dot. The next most commonly used letter is a T, so they made it a dash. And they tried to make the most frequently used letters the simplest codes. They made a little list, but the important part is they all agreed as to what it would be. And the reason Morse code works is because the guy at each end of the communication line knows the same code, but it's arbitrary. It's arbitrary. That's a simplex code because a dot dash is always A. Not all codes are like that. There are codes that are error detecting. An example is in a computer, we have a thing called a parity bit. It only takes 7 bits, say, to represent what you want. You add an 8th bit, but you always adjust it so that the total number of bits is odd. That way, if for some reason in transmission one of the bits gets changed, you can tell right away you've got an error and you retransmit. So it doesn't correct the error, but lets you know when there's one that's created. It's not foolproof. There's some kinds of, if you lose 2 bits in there, it can be thrown. But typically, the high probability is that you've lost 1 bit. So a parity check when you transmit information, in fact, most computers have a form of parity built into the hardware. Those are error detecting codes. Now what you can do, if you make the code large enough, you can do parity checks on groups of letters such that how the parity comes out tells you which position is wrong, and you can reverse it in binary. That's an error-correcting code. Error-correcting codes are more sophisticated, obviously, than error-detecting codes. Error-detecting code tells you that if you're transmitting and stuff, that somehow there's a garbling on the transmission. That's one thing. On the other hand, it's possible to design codes that correct errors. Now, they're bulkier, so they take a little more bandwidth. And there are military computers. I can remember I was working with a major think tank some years ago, and I remember when the first AFSQ 27 came out, that huge air defense machine, you could go and pull cards out of it and it would continue running. Because the circuitry was designed to sustain failures and continue running. Because it would not only detect, but it would also, when it detected, it would correct it, it would run on to a certain level. The point is, each one of these levels is a higher level of sophistication requiring more design. And then, of course, what really starts to get hairy is you can have adaptive coding schema. Some of your bandwidth compression in graphics. It looks at the picture and decides what kind of coding will give you the most compression and so forth. Some of these coding schemes change the syntax, which is the actual language will alter its own structure. So these things can get really hairy. Now, why am I getting into all of this? Well, I'd like to talk just briefly about the DNA. We hear a lot about that. In legal work now and in all kinds of cultural exposures, we find the DNA is the gigantic discovery. And enormous progress is being made continually in understanding this incredible code. We discover that in all cells, all living cells, there is a wrapped up code. We discovered the code is incredibly elegant, incredibly designed, and the same, by the way, in all forms of life. That's kind of interesting. It speaks of a unified design. But moving on, most of us have had some exposure to this famous double helix, because this code, these 3 billion rungs that make up our DNA, are folded into a cell that's microscopic. If you unravel it, I think it comes out to be about 7 feet long. But moving on, what's interesting that most people don't realize is the DNA code we now discover is a digital code. It's an error-correcting code. It deals with an alphabet of 4 letters, and it always uses 3 of the 4 letters in such a way that you can detect errors. You can detect an error rate as much as 1%. And that's about the error rate of the ambient radiation that these DNA codes have been designed to endure. And the more we study the DNA code, and we have yet to fully unravel it, the more we discover it exploits the most advanced design concepts in language that we know of. It's the same design of all life, which if you're going to look at it from my point of view, it proves that it all came from the same software house. We also discover in the cell there's equipment, so to speak, that's designed to copy this and use the copies for manufacturing. That literally is true. The DNA gets copied to be an RNA, and that RNA is what's used to build proteins and all this stuff. And these machines that read that and fabricate the necessary proteins are adaptive. The analogy I might use is like reaching in your toolbox and grabbing a hammer while you need a hammer. But if you discover what you really need is a saw, it turns into a saw. In other words, it changes its function depending on the requirement. And this isn't fancy words for simple ideas. These machines are incredibly complex. Now, this happens to be a list of the nucleotide codes in the DNA. Using an alphabet of 4, 3 out of 4, you end up with 64 choices that designate 61 different elements that can make up the various elements that are made from the DNA that make up the various proteins for your body. I'm not going to get into all of this. Mark may choose to get into some of this in his talk, but the point I'd like to make is that startled me is that if you look right here, you see the start and their start. These codes have 2 meanings depending on where they fit. It's a changing syntax, but these, used the right way, are the start codes of the message. And then these things are assembled in some order to make up the protein that it needs. And up here, these codes are the stop codes. You and I would call that punctuation. This thing is designed to set up messages. Using these codes, those messages instruct the machines what proteins to build. And their start and stop bits. Now, this, of course, all happened by chance, right? Not likely. This DNA thing always intrigues me because most of us have had some exposure to the DNA through Jurassic Park or some of those kinds of entertainments. A lot of people always ask me, you know, they always get these questions about the resurrection. You know, a lot of people don't have too much trouble with the spirit, soul, those kinds of things. But this concept of the bodily resurrection that the Bible deals with is a real hang-up for a lot of people. And the skeptics love to play on this one. You know, how can these guys, these bodies that get decomposed, that then become part of the organic matter that grows crops and whatever, how can they ever be resurrected? Or another example that's often thrown up, what about the cannibal that eats the missionary? And then another cannibal eats that cannibal. I mean, how is that missionary going to get resurrected? You know. Well, let's back up a minute. First of all, you and I are actually made up of essentially 17 elements. And it's interesting that these 17 elements happen to be the same elements that you find in the dust of the ground. Literally. I don't know how Moses knew that, as he emphasizes that in the Torah. But the main point is the atoms that make you up, the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, and what have you, are fungible alphabets. When a printer is setting type, if he's still manually setting type, he reaches into his box and he picks out an A. He can take any one of the A's, as long as they're the same font and all that, right? If it's competently set up, the letters are fungible. don't have to take a particular A. Any one of those A's will do it within a certain font. You follow what I'm saying? These atoms are fungible. If God wanted to resurrect you with the same metabolism that you presently operate under, I'm not saying he will, but just hypothetically, if that's what he was going to do, he can take any carbon, hydrogen, oxygen atoms and put them together. What he needs, it would seem, is nothing more than your DNA. Your DNA contains your whole genetic history. Let's say he needs your DNA plus a little bit, but it's strictly information. And that's the thought that's really behind this Jurassic Park entertainment, where we have a DNA of a dinosaur encapsulated in amber by this mosquito, by a little bit of blood, and they capture that DNA and attempt to splice its missing parts, and out of that, of course, these creatures are cloned. The point of the whole thing is that it's information. The idea of these living creatures, these prehistoric creatures being recreated, of course, are an extension of what we presently know. And yet, what makes that so popular among thinking people is the bridges that are missing are not that substantial, but it does demonstrate, at least in our own mind's eye, this idea of the resurrection. Now, one of the things that may surprise you is Dr. Frank Tipler is the professor of mathematical physics at Tulane University and a professed atheist. He's an expert in cosmology, information science, and particle physics. And he undertook a project to try to synthesize all that we think we know from the Big Bang to the ultimate heat death of the universe. Because of the entropy laws, scientists know that eventually, millions of years or whenever, the universe would wind down to where all temperature is uniform, there's no more energy available, and it grinds to a halt, the so-called heat death. Well, he tried to rationalize what we think we know between these two extremes, and he came to two conclusions that shocked him. As he undertook this ambitious project, one of the conclusions that he came to won't surprise you, but it shocked him. He came to the conclusion, studying just the laws of physics and mathematics, that God, in the form of the classic Judeo-Christian model, exists. I know you say, well, no kidding, Dick Tracy. Listen, anytime a PhD exhibits common sense, you should rejoice. You should. And if you think I'm kidding, you look at the nonsense that's being promoted with the Jesus Seminar and other fools that have all these PhDs and H2SO4s after their name. The whole existence of a PhD is a symptom of insecurity in the first place, but let's move on. The second conclusion that Frank Tipler came to may surprise you. He also came to the conclusion, using just the laws of physics and mathematics, he came to the conclusion that all life is destined for a resurrection. And that's a surprise. He published a book called The Physics of Immortality. I don't recommend the book for lots of reasons. It's very specialized, lots of equations you won't understand, but furthermore, he has some misconceptions, unfortunately. You'll learn more about the subject by reading the most important chapter in the Bible. That's your homework assignment, to figure out which is the most important chapter of the Bible. Now, obviously, there's many good candidates for that honor, but I think Paul would tell you that 1 Corinthians 15 is absolutely essential, because without that we have nothing. And that's, of course, the resurrection chapter. And I'll leave you with that as we move on. I'd like to talk a little bit about something else, as long as we've plunged into systems engineering here, strictly at a lay level, of course, but still, most people, unless you've been in the computer industry, really do not have a perspective of how software is developed. We know all about hardware. In fact, one of the things I'm fond of pointing out is that if I had a computer up here, a bigger one with all the parts that I could hold up and show you, or even this one I'm using, if you knew everything there is to know about every part in this computer, every wire, every microcircuit, every memory cell, every head on every disk, you name it, you knew everything there is to know about every piece of hardware technology, could you tell me anything about this machine's behavior? The answer is no. Because it's simply an engine that's designed to process software. Software determines its behavior. The hardware is an infinite state machine. And the programs that run in it modify themselves. There's some implications of that. And to try to understand that a little better, I'd like to talk about this strange creature we call software. We use it so glibly, and yet there's some interesting things about it. When computers were first emergent on the scene, late 40s, early 50s, typically what they did is they reached into memory, grabbed a number, reached into memory, grabbed another number, and did something with those two numbers, add, subtract, whatever. You had to write the instructions step by step. Go to memory location XYZ, grab this number, bring it into register, reach to another, and then add them, and you step by step by step, you told it exactly what to do. That's the way they started, of course. Now that turns out to be what we call machine language. You're communicating with the computer in terms of its own little bits. And the word isn't add, by the way. It's some cryptic little code that the machine will interpret to mean add, by the way the hardware is organized. That's at the machine level. That turns out to be a very expensive way to handle a machine. It's also very error prone. You have to be exactly precise so the thing goes haywire. So it didn't take very long for programmers to write programs that would make that job easier. One of the most complicated things you end up having to deal with is managing the memory space you've got. And so they developed ways to do that semi-automatically. And they wrote programs that would allow you to speak to the machine symbolically. You could actually say, add the location of this to the location of that. And they called the software assemblers for reasons I won't bother to get into. This level is still called today, it's really very close to the machine, but it's a lot easier than dealing with a machine directly. And I don't know, very rarely does anyone deal with a machine directly today, but the point is that was the evolution. So we found in the 50s, of course, you had assemblers. Now these pieces of software are designed for a specific piece of hardware, and every time you bought a computer, you had to get an assembler for it in order to be able to deal with it. Well, that also is very clumsy, very expensive. You improved the cost by 100 to 1 probably as you developed assemblers. But there's a better way to go. Most people who have a problem can express that problem in what's called a procedure language. It turns out that most engineers like deal in formulas. And it's not that hard to take a formula and write a program that will translate that formula into the codes to perform that formula. And so we have a thing called a compiler. They're probably the most dramatic breakthrough in the computer technology in the late 50s. The algebraic compiler, Algol, was probably one of the first manual, Fortran, COBOL. What they typically did is they wrote programs that would deal in terms that were comfortable to a particular market segment, particular people that had a certain kind of problem, and allow you to express your problem in terms you're comfortable with. The compiler would take what you're saying, assuming you're following the rules of the compiler, and it would compile those codes that would be then given to the assembler that would go into the machine language that would run your problem. And compilers lowered the cost of programming by over 100 to 1, but they did something else. The compilers made you free of any particular machine. This was done very imperfectly in the early days, but one of the goals was to make your programs machine independent. If you did it properly, you could run it on an IBM machine or a UNIVAC machine or control data, whatever. So that's the next level. But the point is, the guy with the problem didn't deal with the machine. He dealt with the compiler. The compiler would figure out the best way to solve his problem. It was very humbling. I remember this vividly because many of the purists said they'd rather hand code it because it's more efficient. And then they saw compilers that wrote code that was smarter than the ones they were writing. These compilers got to be, as a major science, was very clever. Well, of course, even today, you don't really deal with compilers directly generally. More and more people are dealing with software packages that I'll lump together and call application generators. Today, if you've got an application, you'll describe it in broad terms, and that generator will generate the instructions to the compiler, to the assembler, to the machine. And the point being, as you go down this path from the very general conceptions down through the compilers, through the assemblers, to the machine language, the machine is making its own inferences, it's modifying its own behavior, and that behavior is modified while your program is running. Now, I didn't get into all of this to bore you about software development, except to make a point. What's interesting about the technology of software is you can go from application generators down to machine language, but you can't go the other way. There are exceptions to this, but in general, the problem is if you have the machine language, it's almost impossible for you to infer the design of the software. You can use it, but you can't develop the design to change it. That's the reason you have a software industry today. You can go to a computer store and buy someone's proprietary program and use it, assuming you've paid the fee and so forth. You can use it to your heart's content, but you generally can't get in there and alter it. Because in order to alter it, you have to know the intent of what's behind it. And the thing is self-modifying. There are exceptions and there are ways they can decompile, but those are really specialist exceptions. The truth of the matter is you generally can't go uphill, because that implies that you infer what was in the designer's mind as those instructions execute. And now the reason I think this is so fascinating is I think this is one of the reasons that the field of psychology is doomed to frustration as it tries to get beyond the psyche. You see, we have bodies, we have a soul, and we have a spirit. The field of psychology is trying to infer the design of the software by observing the external behavior. The analogy would be, it's as if the analyst was trying to understand how my software is organized by simply observing the input-output channels. And it's very easily to prove that it's mathematically impossible, virtually impossible, because there's a point beyond which psychology cannot go. It cannot ever discover the spirit. Now, by the way, that's exactly what Hebrews 4:12 tells you, that only the Word of God can unravel that. If you want to find out how Excel or WordPerfect or one of these packages are organized, you need the designer's manual. And by the way, we have one for ourselves. It's interesting that people have a very legitimate, desperate need to understand how we're organized. And it's futile to go to the writings of a paranoid schizophrenic who lived in Vienna so many years ago to rely on his conjectures just because they've become part of our vocabulary in this day. You see, you need the owner's manual, and we have it in our laps. 7 times in the New Testament, the Bible tells you, you are the temple of God. 7 times it says that. Now, it may be just using that as a broad figure of speech, and that's very reasonable, because indeed the Holy Spirit dwells in us and so forth, fine. But I personally am convinced it means far more than that. And I think the interesting thing, once you understand the architecture of the temple, not just the tabernacle. I've always studied the tabernacle until my wife discovered this and pointed out to me. The temple also was given by the Holy Spirit, the architecture. And the architecture of the temple is different than the tabernacle in some subtle ways, and yet they're very meaningful ways. And I won't derail tonight's discussion to get into all of that. We've got several materials. The Architecture of Man is a briefing package that tries to deal with that. And of course, all of that material is also included in my wife's book, The Way of Agape. And is also the basis for a coming book, The Be Transformed. So these materials are out there, these views, and they've been endorsed by some excellent Greek scholars, so where this isn't out in left field. In fact, it's very basic stuff that we even find alluded to some degree in some of the ancient commentaries. But let's move on. You can't go uphill, so to speak. Now, I'd like to talk just a moment about the physics of software. How many of you recognize this? Can you see that back there? That's a what? A diskette, right? If I take a blank diskette and put it on a very sensitive postal scale, it'll weigh about 0.7 of an ounce. If I spend several $100s and load it with over 1 million bytes of software and put it on that same scale, what will it weigh? 0.7 of an ounce. The point being, software has no mass. Its embodiment at some instant may have mass. But software itself has no mass. In fact, it has no mass. I can send this through the airwaves, right? That's a very important thing to understand. Software has no mass. Now, if you've been paying attention to our previous briefings, if you've heard any of these, you know that we've spent some time demonstrating to you that time is a physical property and varies with mass, acceleration, or gravity. Time is a physical dimension. That which has no mass is beyond the constraints of time. So software, in and of itself, has no time dimension. Its embodiment might at some time. And that leads to a very key concept, your true nature. The real you is software, not hardware. If I look out there at the audience, many of you have been with me in these lectures for, 15, 20 years. Pray for those poor people. And yet, as well as I think I may know you, I can't see the real you. All I can see is the temporary residence that you're dwelling in. The real you has no mass. Now, your temporary dwelling has mass. In fact, in my case, a little too much mass. But the real you call it soul or spirit, label it what you like. The real you is software, not hardware. It happens to be dwelling in hardware at the moment. Hardware that is subject to the curse of Genesis 3, subject to the entropy laws, subject to bondage, the bondage of decay. But the real you is software, not hardware. Now, since the real you has no mass, the real you has no time dimension. Your body has a constraint of time. And for some of us, we're perhaps beginning to realize it's coming to the end, as we get out of breath up certain stairs that we used to take quickly. Every time I go to Israel, I notice Masada is a little higher than it used to be. And that means, and this is perhaps the most terrifying fact I have for you this evening, you are eternal whether you like it or not, whether you want to be or not. The real you is eternal. That's not good news if you're not in Christ. Because if you'll excuse me mixing the metaphor, eternity is a long time. And you'll either spend it in the presence of God or be denied the presence of God. To be in the presence of God, it's no problem. All you have to do is be perfect. Jesus pointed out in, I think, Matthew 7, right? Be thou perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect. God cannot look upon sin. And by the way, you and I are pretty despicable characters when we really measure it in terms of God's standards. Very frightening stuff. The Scripture speaks of two deaths. The death we think of death is the separation of the soul and the body. But there's a second death, and that's the separation of the soul from God. And that's a terrifying thing. There's no way you and I can really appreciate or understand or apprehend that concept. So there's all kinds of idioms that are used to communicate that to us, the terrifying nature of that. Now, God has a destiny for us that's so incredible. There's nothing we can do to earn it. There's nothing we can do to merit it. It's so fantastic that in our despicable condition, there's nothing we can do to earn it. But the good news is that God has anticipated that and has provided a mechanism by which the eligibility of His Son is available to us for the asking. God knew that man left alone would put himself in a predicament that nothing less than the death of His Son would prevail for that destiny. And so you and I are the beneficiaries of this love story that was written in blood on a wooden cross erected in Judea some 2,000 years ago. And you can seal your eternity before leaving this assembly this evening. I think most of you have probably heard me make comments about my laptop computer. As most of you know, I travel continually, writing, and I also still have to write while I travel. In other words, I have a very aggressive schedule, so I have to write the newsletter, some commentaries, a briefing pack, and so forth each month. And at the same time, I'm trying to run around and see as many people as is practical. So I have to keep moving. I have to operate with a laptop on planes and hotel rooms or whatever. Well, my laptop of more than 20 years finally died, gave up the ghost, if I can use that figure of speech. Of course, I was in big trouble because I couldn't afford a new one, and yet I was dependent on one. And fortunately, some friends of the ministry treated me to an incredible, sharp new laptop. And of course, I remember the first time I fired this thing up, plugged it in, came up, and then I started loading all my favorite software pieces, all my various crutches that I've developed over 20 years. 25 years, I guess. Anyway, a long time. I've had computers in my home since, 74, I think it was. I was in the industry, so I had a lot of early stuff. Anyway, the point is, I've developed. I have my favorite word processing stuff. I have all kinds of other notes and things that I lean on. I just accumulate this stuff. Well, I put all these tools and packages in there, and they came up running, and I was back in business. I could operate. They operated recognizably, except for a couple of things. They ran 100 times faster in full color, with a graphic interface and all this stuff, And I remember just being blown away by having them familiar and yet so incredibly enhanced. It hit me like a ton of bricks. You and I are also heading for an upgrade.